So just a little primer, where is human trafficking? So human trafficking is everywhere, all over the globe. Forced labor is the most common form of human trafficking. And 25 million people are trafficked worldwide. And 75% of the victims are women and children. And 81% of the cases involve forced labor. In forced labor, complex supply chains impede traceability and make it challenging to verify that goods and services are free of forced labor. Globally and in the United States, forced labor and associated harmful employment practices hide the true cost of labor. The United States Department of Labor has identified 156 goods from 77 countries that are produced with child labor or forced labor globally, some of which are connected to products imported into the United States, and cotton is one of these products. So this chart is from World Vision Action, and I won't go into the detail because our first presenter is going to do that, I'm sure. But it involves forced labor and child labor around the world, including the US, in all the aspects of cotton production: cultivating, planting, harvesting, ginning or the removal of seeds, and manufacturing. So tonight, we have the honor of having Allison Gill, who is Senior Campaign Coordinator at the International Labor Rights Forum, Nely Rodriguez with the Alliance for Fair Food and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and Sam Malriat, oh, I'm sorry, Sam, I spelled your name wrong there, Director of Organic Consulting at the Rodale Institute. I really apologize for that. First up, I'd like to introduce you to Allison Gill, who's going to be first to present to you. Allison is a human rights lawyer, researcher, and advocate. She joined International Labor Rights Forum in August 2019 as the Senior Cotton Campaign Coordinator, leading strategy for a multi-stakeholder coalition to eliminate forced and child labor in cotton production in Central Asia and to open space for organizing and workers' rights. She has a deep experience as a human rights investigator and advocate with more than 20 years of experience working in the countries of the former Soviet Union. Before joining ILRF, she was senior research and policy advisor to the Uzbek Forum, where she authored numerous reports and submissions to international bodies on forced labor in the cotton sector in Uzbekistan, among other issues. So I'm pleased that Allison's able to join us tonight. And I am going to try to unshare my screen. Okay. Okay. And Allison, you can share your screen or start anytime you like.
Thanks so much, Fern, and hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for your interest in this topic. And I will attempt to share my screen. Oops. Tell me, do you see it?
Not yet.
Give me a second. How about now?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
Great. Well, Fern gave me already a pretty big introduction, so thanks for that, Fern. I just wanted to share a little bit about what we do to identify and also to work to end forced labor and forced labor risks in cotton supply chains. Fern mentioned our work in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. We also work in the Uyghur region of China, also known as Xinjiang. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that, and I'll talk about that in some more detail in just a moment. The cotton campaign is, I'm going to talk about my coalition's separately. So the Cotton Campaign is a multi-stakeholder coalition. We consist of independent trade unions, human rights groups, labor rights groups, academic partners, socially responsible investors, and also brands and retailers that have committed not to knowingly source Uzbek or Turkmen cotton in their supply chains until forced labor has ended there. We were founded in 2007 in response to massive state-imposed child labor and forced labor in Uzbekistan's cotton fields. At the time, Uzbekistan was running the largest government-imposed forced labor system in the world, at its peak, having over 1 million people, including children, in forced labor. We also joined together with Uzbek civil society organizations and responded to their call for an international boycott of Uzbek cotton to try to bring about an end to the forced labor system. And over the years, we have used a variety of tools, from independent monitoring of the cotton fields, reporting on those findings, various advocacy actions with governments and international institutions, and also attempts to get accountability for violations. And I'm really very excited to say that our work in Uzbekistan after 15 years has produced significant results. And this year in 2021 is the first year, the previous harvest in 2021 is the first harvest in which we did not identify state-imposed forced labor in the cotton harvest. So it's a really significant achievement. It reflects the work of many different stakeholders and of course the political will of the government. And now our work is shifting to look to ways to ensure that those reforms can be sustainable and that workers' rights can be protected throughout the cotton supply chain. In Turkmenistan, our work remains at the stage of advocacy, accountability, monitoring, and documentation. Turkmenistan is a very closed and repressive regime, but they rely heavily on cotton as a form of state income. Turkmen cotton is banned from entering the US, but enters the US nonetheless in various forms, including in finished goods, and gets into global supply chains in various ways. So there's still work to be done there. My organization, Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, it's two organizations that actually merged, is also a co-founder and a co-chair of a coalition to end Uyghur forced labor, which is similarly a multi-stakeholder coalition that came together about 2 years ago to address egregious atrocity crimes, including state-imposed forced labor, targeting Uyghur people and other Turkic and or Muslims in the Uyghur region in China. And the coalition's work has centered on calling on companies to ensure they're not supporting or benefiting the forced labor system by disengaging their entire supply chains from the Uyghur region and any connection to the Uyghur region. And although we've expanded to include other supply chains, our initial focus was on the cotton and garment textile supply chain and remains very much in that area. And I'll talk in a little bit about why there is such an important connection between the cotton supply chain and forced labor in China. But just to zoom out for a second, Fern gave an introduction about forced labor and forced labor in cotton in particular, but just so that everyone has a shared understanding, forced labor, according to the ILO Convention 29, is all worker service that is exacted under the threat of penalty and for which a person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So it's really those two components, work that is involuntary and work that is under some threat of penalty. And that threat can be explicit or perceived. So a person has to both not want to do the work, but also fear real consequences if they refuse. And then state-imposed forced labor, which is my area of expertise, is forced labor that is exacted by public authorities. And there can be private actors involved in that as well as sort of proxies as we see in China. But there is that government control element. Forced labor can be hard to document, particularly for outsiders. It can be hard to look at a situation and understand the complexity of whether or not there is true voluntariness, whether or not there is a true fear of penalty and what that might be. And so the ILO has developed 11 key indicators of forced labor. And these are really supposed to be operational indicators for researchers, labor inspectors, trade unions, or others that might be involved in identifying, documenting, helping to prevent or mitigate or remedy forced labor. And these indicators really look at the whole holistic range of reasons that somebody might find themselves in an involuntary work situation or the threats that they might face. People can be incredibly vulnerable because of their social status, caste status, other situation. Sometimes they fall prey to deceptive recruitment practices or false promises by employers. If you find that a worker is not able to leave the work site or that the work site is closed or locked, that can be an indication of forced labor. Workers that are kept in isolation, and this can be often, it's less true in farm work, but can be very true of domestic work, sex work, and other kinds of trafficked labor. Physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats. If the employer or labor broker or other agent holds the identity documents, which can make it hard for a person to leave or have autonomy. Withholding of wages and debt bondage are key ways that workers can be bound to a particular employer against their will. Abusive living and working conditions, as well as excessive overtime. A couple of the human rights risks linked particularly to the cotton sector, or that shouldn't say it was by cotton, just cotton, is state-imposed forced labor. Because cotton is an agricultural product, there are really low unionization rates for farm workers. And we see a lot of forced labor in cotton harvesting in particular, which is labor-intensive, often manual labor. And again, there's low unionization for seasonal workers. Many workers in the cotton sector are vulnerable. Either they're migrants or internal migrants. Many of them are women. Many of them are dependent on cash income and may not have a lot of freedom to choose employment. The cotton sector is tricky because there are a lot of weak or inadequate certification schemes or auditing schemes that purport to protect or declare that labor rights were observed, but in fact are inadequate to the task. What we need are independent mechanisms for field level monitoring, and those typically don't exist in the cotton sector. Many cotton producing countries where we see a lot of labor rights violations have a weak enabling environment for labor rights. So that might be constraints on workers' ability to organize or express themselves, or they may lack access to real grievance mechanisms or remedy. And in cotton, one thing that we see is that there has been, I think, a real important growth of understanding of the environmental risks associated with cotton production that has led to various sustainability indicators and sustainability protection schemes. And some of those have then tried to bring labor on board to be kind of an umbrella for labor and social or environmental and social rights. But in many of them, we see that the labor rights aspect, if not an afterthought, is weak or performed by agronomists or environmental experts instead of labor rights experts. And there have been some real weaknesses documented in those. And then I think Fern alluded to this as well, but another risk is the real complexity and opacity of cotton supply chains. So this is a picture. We think about a supply chain as being linear, but this is it's really more like a web. And so we as consumers might buy a cotton garment or a piece of home textiles that contain cotton, but that is very far removed, many stages of manufacturing and processing, and often transshipment from where that cotton was grown. And so we might know something about how it was produced, maybe at the later stages, but there is not a lot that tends to link the consumer to actually cotton production itself. And many end users of cotton and producers of cotton goods have no idea where the cotton in their products is sourced from. So you can see the small icon, the little farmer with the pitchfork who produces the cotton. That's where a lot of our work has focused. But after that, cotton goes, is transported to a gin, to a spinning facility where it's made into cotton yarn, then to a textile mill where it is made into fabric, and to a cut and sew or a cut, make, trim facility where it's produced into finished goods. And what I've given you is a simplified version of the cotton supply chain, because we have also dyeing houses, wet processing, trims, embellishing, sometimes brokers involved. So there are many, many, many stages. And it can be really challenging, but not impossible for companies to know something about the labor rights in that whole supply chain. Fern, I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to just move quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions. I wanted to touch just quickly on the specific problem of Uyghur forced labor in cotton supply chains, because it is such a big problem and also top of mind for many since it's been in the news. But the Uyghur region in China has a deep and close nexus to the global cotton supply at every stage of processing. The Uyghur region produces 85% of China's cotton, which amounts to more than 20% of the global cotton supply. Separate to that, China is the world's largest exporter of cotton yarn, fabric, and garments. Some of that production actually occurs in the Uyghur region, and some of it occurs elsewhere in China in facilities that may use transported forced Uyghur labor. China also imports cotton, exports these goods, and because cotton is, as you saw in the cotton supply chain, is transshipped, it can be very difficult for a company to know if its cotton supply chain is tainted with Uyghur forced labor. We estimate that at least 1 in 5 cotton garments currently on the market are at risk of being tainted with Uyghur forced labor. And so it's really important for companies and also governments to take very specific action to extricate supply chains, or for governments to hold companies to account for abuses in their supply chains, really to get at this problem. But if you have questions about it, I think we can talk about it more in the Q&A. As I mentioned, in some supply chain situations, you really want companies to stay and try to mitigate, and remedy abuses in the supply chain. For various reasons, that is impossible to do in the Uyghur region. And the only ethical solution for brands is to completely extricate themselves at every level of the supply chain, including cotton production, from the Uyghur region. I mentioned at the top that social auditing or certification schemes are often used in cotton supply chains as a kind of way for the end user company and sometimes even the consumer to have a guarantee that labor rights were protected throughout the supply chain. Fern, how am I doing on time? Like 2 more minutes? You're muted, but I'll take a couple and then wrap up.
4 or 5 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes, great. I talked a little bit about our view that these certification schemes, sometimes they're called social audits, sometimes they're actual certification programs, sometimes they're licensing, can be quite inadequate to protecting labor rights in cotton production. Just generally, so that you know, a social audit is an evaluation of a workplace to assess it for, labor standards or social or ethical standards. The cost of the audit is usually borne by the farmer or the supplier, not the company that is purchasing the product. They have proven extremely ineffective at detecting and remedying forced labor. I served on an expert task force for one of the largest or most well-known sustainable cotton licensing schemes. And I got some data from them. They had never in 10 years of operation actually ever identified any forced labor, not because there was none, but because the system that they used just wasn't designed to do that in an effective way. And some of the reasons these have tended to be ineffective is that they often really, it's like one auditor or a team of auditors that might visit a facility once or twice. Sometimes these are announced, sometimes they're semi-announced, or they typically don't have enough worker interviews. There might be language barriers. Sometimes they fail to prevent or protect workers from reprisals. It's really important that vulnerable workers in particular, but any worker and vulnerable workers in particular, be able to speak to auditors or labor inspectors or other researchers, either off-site, away from management, so that management isn't aware. Sometimes it's important to visit worker housing and to understand what living conditions they might be in. Audit schemes are often designed as sort of tick box exercises, a checklist, and that can make it really difficult to identify some of the most insidious aspects of forced labor, which is the coercive control, either by the government or by an employer, poor recruitment practices that can lead to forced labor, or recruitment fees paid by workers. And they tend to solely focus on the workplace and may miss some of the other indicators I mentioned, like freedom of movement, abusive living conditions. Audits also tend to lack transparency, so we don't actually know, because it's a commercial arrangement. We don't actually know what the audit results are. So as consumers or advocates, we can't actually know what an audit may have turned up in a supply chain. And they typically have prioritized protecting company reputations. Instead, what we would look for are real worker-centered due diligence processes. And I think colleagues from Fair Food Program are going to talk more about that. So I'll go a little bit quickly here. And really, we want at the farm level there to be credible mechanisms for traceability, for monitoring, for accountability, for workers to have real access to remedy and to grievance and to remedy. And for this, we need to move to a system where companies actually have full visibility of the cotton supply chain and have legal enforceable responsibility for labor rights up and down that supply chain. Some of the elements that would go into such a framework would be enforceability, as I mentioned, credible field or farm level mechanisms. And we would also want to move towards a system where workers have access to capacity building and where companies are participating in ensuring there's an adequate enabling environment for labor rights protections. And then just finally on this, companies, particularly garment companies, have participated in driving standards down globally. I mean, the crisis that we face for workers is not an accident. It was specifically a foreseeable consequence of the way supply chains function. So companies just want to buy a cheap t-shirt, a cheap product. They undercut suppliers on prices. And that means that suppliers tend to trickle down abuses to the worker level. So they don't have enough money to have strong systems in place because they're being undercut at the price level. So we actually want brands to participate in helping there to be a level playing field so that producers and companies are all ensuring that labor rights in their systems are observed. I think I'm going to wrap up now, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Thanks so much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Allison. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you for that. I think, big takeaways are how complex this is. And we are going to talk about that a little bit later in the Q&A, and what people can do to work around this, because clearly the idea is to keep us from being able to check into these suppliers and everything. So So thank you for that. Next up is Nely Rodriguez. Nely is senior staff member and leader of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. As part of the Alliance for Fair Food program, Ms. Rodriguez and her colleagues conduct workers' rights education in the fields on all farms participating in the program. And this is the kind of program that Allison was referring to. Ms. Rodriguez's work at the CIW includes hosting daily radio shows on the CIW's low power community FM radio station, leading the weekly women's group meetings, receiving complaints of abuses in the fields, managing wage theft claims, and investigating cases of modern day slavery. Natalia Naranjo, who is equally as accomplished, will be translating for Nely tonight. So I thank you both for being here. And you can share your screen or start speaking whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you so much.
Sí, bueno, pues buenas noches y muchas gracias a Allison por compartir también un poco de su trabajo y pues también a nuestra anfitriona por invitarnos. Y bueno, soy Nely Rodriguez, también del staff de la coalición.
And so, hi, thank you all so much for having us here, and thanks so much to our hosts for inviting us and for opening up these conversations. But my name is Nely Rodriguez, and I'm here from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And my name is Natalia Naranjo. I'll be interpreting for Nely today. I also want to add, there'll be times where you like kind of see me talking to Nely when we're on mute, but that's me interpreting either questions or comments that people have as we go along as well.
Uh-huh. Bueno, sí, como parte del staff de la coalición, yo también soy trabajadora agrícola por muchos años antes de ser parte del staff. La mayoría de nuestro staff de la coalición estuvimos en los campos piscando el tomate, piscando diferentes frutas y vegetales y sabemos de antemano, ¿verdad?, cuáles son las condiciones que nos ha afectado por mucho tiempo. No nada más es el robo de salario o la violencia o las altas temperaturas, la falta de agua y de baños, sino también los casos extremos de violencia, de acoso y de esclavitud, ¿verdad?, que pasaban en los años 90 dentro de la industria agrícola.
And so I'm one of the farm worker staff here at the coalition. And I, as well as all of my colleagues, know very closely what it is to be working within the agriculture industry, working in the fields directly. We are a human rights organization based here in Immokalee, Florida, that have been fighting for many decades to put an end and to put an end to the abuses that we have faced in the fields for many, many years. And we have seen cases anywhere from physical violence, threats, sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the fields, and to more extreme cases, right, of modern day slavery and forced labor cases in the fields for many workers.
Uh-huh. Y es cierto, ¿verdad? En aquellos años, pues no había ninguna manera de cómo el trabajador pudiera reportar esos abusos cuando era golpeado, era amenazado o era robo de salario lo que pasaba, ni las mujeres podían reportar tampoco lo que era el acoso sexual. En nuestra área, Immokalee es un lugar muy rural, que la mayoría de las personas, el mayor porcentaje es gente migrante que viene de Guatemala, de México, de Haití, y que incluso el idioma, ¿verdad? El español es el segundo idioma. Muchos traemos idiomas indígenas como el primer idioma. Entonces, los patrones se valían de eso para tener el control absoluto de los trabajadores.
And so we started organizing in the early 90s to combat a lot of these abuses that we were seeing, to try to change what we were seeing in the fields. And so when we first started meeting, we saw that this wasn't individual cases that people were facing in the fields, that at one point or another, people were seeing cases of wage theft where you weren't being paid for your full week's salary. You weren't given clean bathrooms or access to water or a break in the fields. And so that's kind of like your everyday, but then, right, you have those more extreme cases of abuse and everything. And so we live in a very rural community here in South Florida, where people don't have access to cars, people don't have access to pretty much leave town unless your employer is taking you out of town. And so it was really hard for us to bring awareness to what was happening to us here. We also speak a lot of different languages, right? There's a lot of workers here from Haiti, from Mexico, from Guatemala, and a lot of them, Spanish is their second language, where they speak an indigenous language from their own country. And so communicating with each other was hard enough, but trying to communicate any of the issues that we were facing, either to our bosses, to the owners, or to other people in our own communities, was incredibly difficult.
Ujú. Y en aquellos años, pues sí era una situación muy difícil, ¿verdad? Que muchas de las veces uno no alcanza a reconocer cuando uno está pasando por casos de esclavitud. Y la coalición ahorita ya tiene más de 30 años de estar luchando precisamente para que se respeten los derechos humanos de los trabajadores y parar, ¿verdad?, lo que es la esclavitud moderna, tanto como el robo de salario. Por eso en las décadas de los 90, la coalición empezó a organizarse, precisamente porque vimos, ¿verdad?, que era importante que el trabajador fuera tomado en cuenta y que se valorara el trabajo que nosotros hacíamos. Y en aquellos años era muy común que hubiera casos de trabajo forzado o de esclavitud moderna.
And so when we first started organizing, we used a lot of this language, right? Not only are we seeing these cases of abuse when it comes to physical violence, when it comes to sexual violence, but we're seeing consistently these more extreme cases of modern day slavery, which again, we're in a very rural, isolated area where the language isn't common, where we don't speak English, where we are paid very, very little, not even a living wage most of the time. And so the conditions are incredibly poor, and they're created that way so that these abuses are very easy to happen. And so then we see a lot of cases of modern day slavery, and they start to come up even more. And that's what we've been fighting for ever since, right? Not only to put an abuse to these everyday abuses, an end to these abuses that we're seeing every day, but we're also trying to put an end to these cases of modern day slavery that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And so you would see a lot of workers come forward with their stories, and they're very horrific, the type of work and the type of conditions that they would put people through.
Uh-huh. Y en aquellos primeros años, cuando la coalición empezó a organizar, el enfoque de nosotros era tener respeto, tener dignidad y mejores salarios. Pero conforme la coalición fue creciendo, muchos trabajadores empezaron a aprender sobre sus derechos, empezaron a salir casos de esclavitud, ¿verdad? Donde los trabajadores eran sometidos a trabajo forzado, a trabajar sin agua, a trabajar bajo golpes, bajo amenazas y sin recibir ni un centavo o casi nada de pago. Lo que se recibía pues era pago con droga, pago con cerveza. De ese modo los patrones estaban manteniendo al trabajador siempre en una deuda, porque los enviciaban a estar ahí y ellos tenían el control absoluto del trabajador.
And so you're seeing these cases, and sometimes you would ask yourself, right, what's the difference between these cases of wage theft, where workers aren't getting paid for their work at the end of the week, and the difference between the cases of modern day slavery? These aren't cases that are similar to it. These aren't cases that kind of remind you of slavery. These are cases of slavery today. They were cases where workers not only were chained up while they were working, but they would be chained up once they're returned back home. Their living conditions didn't provide them with bathrooms, kitchens. They would be not only held under threat and of violence, right, held at gunpoint to continue working, chained up. Some of them would be threatened and had their papers taken away from them so that they couldn't leave. And if they did leave, how were they going to identify themselves? And most importantly, right, they had these false debts created. So they would be given water, they would be given food, they would be given these very inadequate shelters. And then at the end of the week, they would make maybe $200 to $300 and their debts were $500. And so they're continuously kept under these debts so that even if they do have a moment where they can leave, they, in their mind, right, they're indebted to these people so much that they can't leave this work. And so there's the way that these cases come up are more extensive and there's so much more detail to them. But in these early years in the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw these cases come up even more frequently. And so again, this is an environment, this is a workplace where these cases are very natural, right? The work is meant to happen this way, and it's meant to be able to take advantage of people who are already in a very vulnerable state.
Entonces, nuestro enfoque, ¿verdad? Era tener esa campaña para que el trabajador fuera respetado. Pero conforme los años iban pasando, nos íbamos organizando en la comunidad, empezaron a salir los casos de esclavitud. En los años 95, después salió en el 97, en el 99, en el 2000. Consecutivamente, en 20 años, los primeros 20 años de la coalición, salieron más de 7 casos de esclavitud moderna y la coalición llevó a las rejas a más de 15 patrones que fueron sentenciados por tener a trabajadores en contra de su voluntad, y un juez federal lo llamó como esclavitud moderna.
Le agregamos lo de el programa, las demandas.
Ahorita voy con eso.
Okay. And so we saw these cases in 96, 97, in the early 2000s. And when we brought the proof, when we did our own investigations of what was happening in the field, when we started talking to the police and to other agencies, and we brought this forward, there was no other word, right? There was a judge who received many of these cases, or one judge during one of the cases that said there's no other way to call this other than modern day slavery. And so we started to organize against that in our community. We started to work as a group of people to be able to change the way and what we were seeing in our own workplaces as well.
Viendo esto, vimos la necesidad de buscar otra manera de cómo comprometer a los rancheros, a las corporaciones y al consumidor. Buscamos soluciones, cómo podíamos solucionar ese problema, y vimos, ¿verdad?, que la mejor solución era involucrar no nada más a los productores, sino al comprador y al consumidor. Empezamos a crear lo que era el programa de comida justa, que era básicamente trabajar junto con esos 3 cabezas principales, que tiene mucho que ver desde lo que es los surtidores a las corporaciones y al consumidor, creando el programa de comida justa y también comprometiendo a las corporaciones a que ellos también apoyaran y empujaran a los rancheros, a sus surtidores, a cumplir un código de conducta que incluía un centavo más por cada libra de tomate, también el comprometerse a respetar un código de conducta donde había 0 tolerancia para la esclavitud y el trabajo forzado, y también que el trabajador tuviera una voz dentro de cualquier acuerdo que hubiera con las corporaciones. Tenía que estar presente la voz del trabajador.
And so when we started to organize, we were thinking, what's the best way to change an industry that we're at the very bottom of? And so we started trying to get the farm owners themselves to make these changes. And we saw no difference there. We saw that farm owners didn't care, and pretended to not know what was happening in the fields. We saw that there was these huge multi-million-dollar companies that were buying and purchasing from the tomato fields and other fields as well. And that's where we saw that the consumer had a say of how these companies spent their money, because it was the consumer's money. And so we launched a campaign alongside consumers, alongside community members, students, churches and congregations, and brought awareness to what was happening to us in these fields. And so once we did that, we launched this big campaign against some of the biggest corporations in the country. And we did so with 3 demands, right? Our first demand was to change the way that we were being paid. Not only were we making below minimum wage, we weren't even making a living wage most of the time. And as you could tell, right, the work is very physically demanding of us. And so we were demanding to be paid 1 penny more per pound for the tomatoes that were harvested in the field. And so just to give a little context, one thing I would add is that workers only get paid per bucket. So if you saw behind here, right, and this is in most of you get paid per bucket, so not per hour or per day. So it just depends on how fast and how quickly you can harvest. And so to be paid 32, and then to be paid 1 penny more per pound is definitely a big increase. The second demand that we had was ensuring that these cases of modern day slavery, of sexual violence, of physical violence, and verbal abuse in the field, that there was an end to it, ensuring that the worker's voice was heard overall. And the third demand, right, had to do with that worker's voice, that any changes that were happening in the fields, any changes to the labor or anything like that was coming directly from the farm workers themselves, instead of the managers, the farm owners, or anything. And so we were able to do this because we launched a campaign against some of the biggest fast food chains and supermarkets in the country.
Entonces creamos, ¿verdad?, estos acuerdos legales que en dado caso de que no se cumplan por parte de los rancheros donde trabaja la mayoría de los trabajadores, que hay una violación, está la consecuencia de mercado, que es que los rancheros no pueden vender sus productos a las corporaciones que están participando bajo el programa de comida justa. Hoy en día tenemos 14 corporaciones que están comprometidas a vigilar que estos derechos se cumplan y que si hay casos de esclavitud o de trabajo forzado, inmediatamente ellos cortan la compra a esos ranchos. Hay una consecuencia hoy en día para cuando hay este tipo de violaciones, y se ha creado también un tercer partido donde ellos hacen, ese tercer partido es independiente, son investigadores que van a los ranchos a hablar con cada trabajador independiente para ver si hay problemas, ellos reportan a los investigadores. Después se creó una línea de quejas las 24 horas del día y los 7 días de la semana. Y está en los 3 idiomas, en creol, en inglés y en español. Porque así la comunidad, es el idioma que la comunidad necesita.
Here's what I found.
And so we were able to create this program as workers. And this program is now backed by these corporations. So there's this monetary value, right? If we see a farm or if we see these sort of abuses in the fields, they pull their purchasing power. So a corporation like Walmart can no longer purchase from your farm. And so if there's these cases of modern day slavery or sexual abuse, and so you now can't sell your crops to these corporations. And so that's why this program works, right? We're not asking for the laws to change. We're not asking for these farms to play nice and to treat us fairly. They now have to answer to these big companies, these big corporations that pay them. And so you see this big change because the power dynamics and the power shift from the farm owners directly to the farm workers. And so we have been able to see that change through the Fair Food Program. We have been able to see that we're now able to go in and do these audits. We're now able to go in and talk to them, to talk to workers directly one-on-one on the changes that are happening in the fields. And just something that I would add really quick is right here, you're seeing some of the direct data points of the things that we can calculate, right? This doesn't include like the respect and the change that workers see day to day, but it does give you a sense of how things have been changing in the field.
Entonces, ahorita hemos visto, ¿verdad?, que la mejor manera en que funciona el programa es haciendo la educación de trabajador a trabajador. En todos los ranchos participantes bajo el programa Nosotros vamos y hablamos con los trabajadores sobre sus derechos, qué es esclavitud moderna, cómo se ve. También se reparte el bono, van de 39 millones de bono que se ha repartido. Las quejas, que el trabajador tiene el derecho de hacer quejas sin represalia, porque cuando hay una represalia para el trabajador por quejarse, también hay una consecuencia para el ranchero.
And so we're seeing that difference for every worker in the fields, right? Workers are, as you can see, are now able to make a complaint without the fear of being fired, without the fear of being told that the police are going to be called on them, without the fear of losing their livelihoods. Workers are now receiving that bonus, right? So it has now led to a $39 million bonus. Workers are no longer afraid to go to work, whether they're going to be facing sexual harassment in the fields or they're going to be facing sexual or violence in the fields. And it has now changed greatly how workers see their day to day. And they're now receiving these education sessions. So there's not just this like general idea of, oh, we have rights now. Oh, there's been this change. We go in and one-on-one talk to workers to let them know of these changes.
Y aunque se ha parado la esclavitud y el trabajo forzado dentro de los ranchos que están participando, pues hoy vemos, ¿verdad?, que la esclavitud moderna todavía sigue pasando, ¿verdad?, en toda la industria, porque aquí mismo en la Florida donde trabajamos, recientemente en el mes de noviembre pasaron 2 casos de esclavitud moderna, que eran ranchos que están fuera del programa, eran ranchos en el norte de Georgia, uno de los más grandes, nombrado así, que era uno de los casos más grandes de esclavitud moderna dentro de la agricultura de los Estados Unidos, porque involucraba más de 70,000 trabajadores que vienen contratados bajo la visa H2A. Y las personas, ¿verdad?, que traían a estos trabajadores habían recibido más de 200 millones de ganancia a consecuencia de tener a trabajadores haciendo trabajo forzado, como trabajar a sacar la cebolla con sus propias manos. Varios trabajadores habían fallecido por golpes de calor, violaciones también a trabajadores. Entonces, todo esto, ¿verdad?, es algo que vemos que la esclavitud sigue pasando dentro de la industria.
And so we're seeing, right, these big changes. And under the Fair Food Program, we have essentially eradicated what is modern day slavery. And here is a brief map that shows you where the program is now and what field it's in now. But we continue outside of this program, right? We continue to see these cases of modern day slavery. We continue to see these abuses. We continue to see forced labor and physical violence in the field outside of the program. And so that's why we continue to fight and continue for this expansion and continue to try to protect workers in every industry, in every field. And until, right, there's an end to these types of abuses and an end to modern day slavery, our work is going to continue to grow and continuously expand as well.
El programa de comida justa hoy en día se ha expandido también a otros estados como en Georgia, Norte y Sur Carolina, hasta Virginia, New Jersey, recientemente en Tennessee. Todo esto, ¿verdad?, es porque nuestra gente de aquí sigue lo que es la temporada a otros estados, y el poder de las corporaciones ha empujado para que estos ranchos que tienen aquí en Florida, sus ranchos, y los tienen también en otros estados, las corporaciones han dicho a los ranchos, si quieres también tener tu compra en otros estados, tienes que también llevar el programa para allá en estos estados para que el trabajador también esté protegido bajo este programa.
And so our work has been able to expand because of the growth, because of the corporations and the companies that have signed on. One thing that I want to add really quickly is I forgot to send this link earlier before, but there's a link to this, essentially all of the data points in this information. And it also has the places that we can purchase our fruits and tomatoes from, that is part of the program. But yes, so with the program, we've been able to expand, because before what we saw is when we were only working in Florida and when we were only able to work within the tomato industry, there was workers that migrate up north with the seasons. And while they were protected here, once they migrated up north with the same bosses, with the same companies, they would then lash out and be very violent towards them up north. And so we had to be able to expand, and to really be able to grow, and continue to protect workers as they went up with the harvest as well.
Y también, ¿verdad? Este modelo hasta ahorita siendo usado, ¿verdad? También por otras organizaciones. En Vermont están los trabajadores de las lecherías que también vivían en las malas condiciones, y ellos vinieron aquí con nosotros a aprender de cómo es el programa y cómo podían ellos usarlo también dependiendo de sus necesidades. Cada grupito que sea trabajador es importante, ¿verdad? Que sea trabajadores para que puedan ellos mismos ver cuáles son los problemas y las soluciones. Entonces, el Vermont, lo de la lechería, ahorita están también usando el programa de comida justa. En Bangladesh, las trabajadoras de la industria textil también están llevando a cabo este modelo para parar, ¿no? La falta de seguridad que había en sus instalaciones. Estamos trabajando también con una organización en Lesotho, que está en el sur de África también, que también tiene muchos problemas de acoso sexual. Y también, ¿verdad? Están en pláticas con algunos rancheros en Texas y en California.
Yeah. But yes, so we've also been able to expand our program into other industries. And that's also why we know we would be able to expand this into cotton or into other industries. For example, what you're seeing here is Vermont. We've been able to expand into the milk and the dairy industry as well. And workers there will be able to now receive some of the same protections and the same safety regulations as well. And we've now been expanding into the flour industry as well, where workers in Virginia have now been not only receiving these health and safety regulations that were created by themselves, but are now receiving higher pay as well. And so we're able to continue expanding and growing, but we also do need that support both from consumers and from these companies as well to allow us to continue to protect workers.
Y yo sé que ya es poco el tiempo, pero pues sí, podemos compartir un poco más de información también, o todos los casos que han pasado de esclavitud donde la coalición ha ayudado a investigar y llevar hasta las cortes federales a las personas, están público, hay información pública también sobre esto.
And so there's so much more we could get into and so much more we could talk about, but we'll also be here for questions and everything after. But I can share that link with those further resources, but our website definitely has a lot more resources and has a lot more information and ways to get connected to our work as well.
Thank you so much, Nely and Natalia. That was amazing. I just wanted to mention, and then we'll move on, in case anybody hasn't sort of tied it together, that the reason that I had Nely and Natalia here, even though they don't work in the cotton industry per se, is that the cotton industry is obviously part of the agricultural industry. And we know that when this happens in one industry, it happens all over in every agricultural industry. And in rural counties where cotton is grown and, you know, all other kinds of products as well, the abuses and the modern day slavery continue. And I'm so glad to see that the Fair Food Program is expanding and moving across the US to prevent this from happening with other products and in other states. So I'm going to move on now to Sam Malriat. Sam is the Director of Organic Consulting Program at the Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, which is a research institute The consulting program provides on-site technical assistance to farmers, landowners, and businesses that are interested in transitioning land to certified organic and regenerative production systems, which Sam is going to tell us all about. Sam earned an agricultural sciences degree from Cornell University and has over 12 years of practical farming experience in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, specializing in vegetable and grain production. Sam's a certified crop advisor and is IOIA certified in crops and livestock. He also serves as board member for Pennsylvania Certified Organic and sits on the governing council for the Organic Farmers Association. So Sam's going to talk about what's called the Regenerative Organic Certification, which is another certification that is relatively new. And I'll let him tell you all about it from an organic cotton perspective. And Sam, thank you so much for being here. I will mute myself and you can.
Thanks so much, Fern, and thanks everybody for having me. I do appreciate this, and I've learned a lot already from this discussion. What I would like to talk a little bit about today is the regenerative organic certification as it may relate to cotton production. But I do want to provide a word of caution here that this is not the solution to this issue, and we're fully aware of that. This is another tool, I guess, a tool in the toolbox that we might have to start asking questions about where things come from and how they're produced. Consumers aren't the only ones looking for this information. It's also farmers are looking for a way to market their products so that consumers can feel safe and comfortable buying them from these farmers. So, and this is an international certification. It started in the United States, and Rodale Institute played a part in helping to build this certification. But the intention is for this to be applicable to farms across the entire world. So I'd like to start just a little bit with the reason Rodale Institute is around and what organic actually means. And then I'll veer right back into the certification discussion, but just would like to take a few minutes on that. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Rodale Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit located in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. We've been around for 75 years, more or less, and our focus has always been on organic cropping systems research. So we focus on research and education in organic agriculture. Our mission is we aim to expand organic agriculture by assisting farmers in successfully transitioning to organic, conducting research on organic farming methods and their impact, and educating consumers on the benefits of organic for people and the planet. Our motto has always been that healthy soil equals healthy food equals healthy people. I'm here with the organic consulting team, which is a fairly new endeavor for the Rodale Institute. We go around, we're on the ground helping conventional farmers transition to organic and regenerative organic production methods. So our mission statement is within the greater Rodale Institute mission statement. We provide technical assistance to farmers. We translate the research results into practical information, and we connect people. We connect farmers with buyers and vice versa. We connect farmers with each other so that they can achieve their long-term goals. I'll very, very briefly cover what organic production is for those of you that aren't familiar. USDA organic is, of course, a United States federal standard. This is a federal law. That's one thing that is really important to keep in mind. And it was passed in 1990 with the Organic Foods Production Act. That's what brought this label into existence. My favorite definition of this production system is from the FAO. It says the production of crops in a system that relies on ecosystem management rather than external agricultural inputs. This label is protected and regulated by the USDA. These operations are inspected, therefore, on an annual basis to make sure that they're complying with the law. In general, this label means that farmers can't use synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, or genetically engineered seed. And many commercial fungicides and insecticides are also prohibited. Sorry about that. What that means in a practical sense is that farmers need to find different ways to control weeds and pests and manage fertility without the use of these tools. And we have always aimed to support farmers in getting those things out of our production system. We don't believe that chemicals in general are a way to foster healthy soils. And if we're not creating healthy soils, then we're not really creating a healthy consumer base. So I just wanted to provide the foundation for this because the certification does have organic in its name. We believe that the USDA organic label is still a trusted label from an agronomic standpoint, and that it's a minimum production standard that farmers should meet. However, we're fully aware that it does not address forced labor and social issues. It doesn't address animal welfare so that it's consistent with public perception. We, as consumers, I'm a consumer as well. I have an idea in my head of the way animals should be treated. And to an extent, the certified organic label does improve animal welfare and some of its regulations, but it doesn't go far enough. And that's something that we recognize. It also doesn't address the continuous improvement of natural resources. Certified organic production, if you're following the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, it should continuously improve soil health and water quality. And it should support things like pollinators and wildlife. But as usual, people have found loopholes with this. And that's something we recognize. The problem is that it's very difficult to move a federal standard and get it to change. It has taken decades, and we've been part of a growing group of people that have tried to change this standard and move it faster the way it should have been originally, but it takes a lot of time to make those changes at the federal level. And this is why some of these issues are still problems with the USDA organic label. It does, however, help farmers meet a good baseline. And that's something we still believe in, that farmers should be meeting some sort of standard so that consumers can have a little bit of confidence in what they do. So then recently, we've got some issues there with the certification. And recently a new term has turned up called regenerative that people have started using to mean, well, we really don't know what. There are no regulations really attached to this term. You know, there's no law that's able to protect this term regenerative. In my experience, farmers that are calling themselves regenerative farmers, that this still allow the use of synthetic herbicides and fertilizers. Not much has changed under regenerative agriculture because there is no enforcement arm. There's no way to back this up. And this preserves the status quo. This does not address exploitation in labor or prevent trafficking. So regenerative is a term that's getting used a lot lately to sort of subvert the system and make it seem that this is something that's better than USDA organic. And in fact, when you really dig down deep and try to find out what regenerative actually means, there's not a whole lot to back it up. So what we did as the Institute was participate in the creation of another certification called the Regenerative Organic Certification. And that takes the term regenerative and it couples it on a certification level with the USDA organic standard, because we believe that's a good baseline for farmers to meet. And then it goes further in saying, well, when consumers think of regenerative, what are they actually looking for? And can we create something that's regenerative, not just for the soil and for animals, but for the consumers actually buying it? So we wanted to take this term before it got tossed around and used and meant basically nothing, and turned into a certification program that we thought would be marketable to consumers, that would allow farmers to get paid more for their product, and that could build that trust over time. So the regenerative organic certification was created by a group of stakeholders. That's companies like Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's, and nonprofits like the Rodale Institute, the Fair World Project, Textile Exchange, to create this certification that goes above and beyond organic, but still uses USDA organic as a baseline. So you can see here that right on their website, it says the ROC certification is a revolutionary new certification for food, textiles, and personal care ingredients. Rock farms and products meet the highest standards in the world for soil health, animal welfare, and farm worker fairness. It is also a 501c3 nonprofit. Again, the work that Allison and Nely and Natalia do will always be the most effective way of mitigating things like forced labor, because they're intimately connected with labor supply chains. But when we look from a consumer standpoint, when consumers are asking themselves, what can we do to make things better? This may be an option. And because it is such a new standard, it just came out in 2019, it's still able to change, and it's still open for input and consumer input. And so this certification is based off of 3 pillars. And the 3 pillars are soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. The social fairness aspect is entirely new to the certification scheme in organic agriculture, because it was not at all addressed by the USDA organic label. But there are also some elements of the soil health and animal welfare sections that go much farther than any of the existing agricultural standards out there. So you can see there are some things contained in each one of these pillars. Soil health is based on conservation tillage using cover crops and crop rotation. Animal welfare is based on the 5 freedoms that allows animals to be free from discomfort, from fear and distress, from hunger, pain, injury, or disease. And in the social fairness pillar, a lot of the things that Allison mentioned are things that the regenerative organic label are striving for. That is capacity building, fair payments for farmers, freedom of association, living wages, and good working conditions. Sometimes there are existing certifications, and I think the Fair Food Program would probably become one of them under the social fairness pillar that can fulfill a farmer's or a producer's obligations to each one of these pillars. Like I said, the USDA organic label is required to become a regenerative organic producer. But if you have animals on your farm and you would like to become a regenerative organic producer, you could have one of these certifications that is Global Animal Partnership or Animal Welfare approved to fulfill your requirements for that animal welfare pillar. So you can see the regenerative organic certification as sort of a, I guess you could describe it as if you were a Boy Scout, maybe this would be your Eagle Scout badge, meaning that you would have some of these other certifications to show that you have met the standards in at each level, each one of these 3 pillars. If we look in the framework, that is the standards by which producers are audited, you can see that there are specific regulations around human trafficking and forced labor, but there's a lot more to it. And I would encourage everyone, I did submit the link to Fern to share with everyone, but I'd encourage everyone to check out the regenerative organic certification framework, and you can see all of the standards that would have to be followed by a producer to become certified. So under the social fairness pillar, this standard also covers equal pay, protection against retaliation, worker voice, that is complaint transparency, fair and living wages, housing and living conditions, hours of work, accident reduction, capacity building, fair pricing to consumers and buyers. And it also addresses things like interns and apprentices, which is fairly uncommon in some other social fairness certifications. And it's in addition to the soil health and animal welfare standards. If you're looking for this label, chances are in the stores you won't find it. And that's because it really is brand new. This just finished its pilot program in 2019 and the beginning of 2020. You can go on the Regenerative Organic Alliance's website and find producers that have obtained this certification. And this is the label that you would be looking for. There are 3 levels, that is bronze, silver, and gold. And as you improve, this whole system is based on continuous improvement. So as you improve as a regenerative organic certified producer, you will move up to the silver and gold levels after you've started with bronze. So these are the representations you may see on a product, a packaged product, that would tell you that it's following the requirements in those 3 pillars of the framework. Patagonia is a company that has participated in the creation of this standard, but is also trialing regenerative organic certified cotton in their products. I don't think they have released many yet. I did take a look at their website prior to this presentation to look around, but like I said, this is very new. So I know that the ROA, the Regenerative Organic Alliance, is open to input, and they would certainly welcome critiques or suggestions or comments from people like Allison and Nely and Natalia, who are very connected with the social fairness aspect of agricultural production. So again, this is just an option. It is very new, so it is something that can change and is dynamic, but we believe we are helping farmers transition to this certification from USDA organic certification. So if there are any growers in your area that are already organic producers, they would be eligible for something like this, and they could be verified through this program and obtain a regenerative organic label. So it's something to look for as a consumer. If you're familiar with any producers that might be interested in this, or you think would sort of fit the mold, we would always be happy to speak with them in obtaining this. These are some of the services that we provide. We are very affordable because we're mission-based and a nonprofit, and we try to subsidize our work with farmers whenever we can. But we do visit every farmer we work with. We will talk to them on the phone to help them try to transition, especially conventional farmers, because we really need to get these synthetic herbicides and fertilizers out of our system. And hopefully pushing conventional farmers closer to the USDA certification, organic certification, will then help open their eyes to something like the regenerative organic certification in the future. We do have consultants all over the country, so it's not just in southeastern Pennsylvania. We have a team of about a dozen right now that will probably add a dozen more this year too. And so if this is something you think a farmer near you or a family member might be interested in, please do reach out. You can visit our website, send us an email, or give me a call at that number there. And again, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this discussion.
Thank you so much, Sam, for being here and for doing that. I think that, you know, the fact that you're talking about how new this certification is, and still working on verification for farm workers and things like that, obviously, you know, that's a great thing that you're working on that, and that you're open to suggestions from people like Allison and Nely and Natalia. I think that's great. And yeah, Patagonia is great, but as you said, that's like the only one that I ever see with the certification symbol. So hopefully that will increase over time as well. So I was hoping that the 3 of you could chat a little bit, but I think that we're kind of running short on time, and there are a lot of questions. So I wanted to quickly introduce our Q&A moderator, who's Courtney Morissette. Courtney, are you there? Can you unmute yourself? And
Yes, hi
There
everyone.
you are. Okay, perfect. So Courtney's gonna moderate some of the questions for you guys, and hopefully everything will kind of congeal together. I hope that everybody got something from each of our speakers. I know that, you know, the issue on cotton is a little tenuous between the three of you, and but I think that's fine, because honestly, as Allison said, the web is so confusing and complex that the fact that we have trouble tying everything together, it just makes sense. So yeah, Courtney, why don't you direct some questions to people? Thank you.
Great. And thank you so much, everyone, for the presentation. Super insightful and really useful. And I think some of these questions may have been touched on already, but I've just compiled them from the chat. One thing I'll share that a couple of folks asked if that copies of the slides will be available. And it looks like from some folks hosting that all links from the presenters will be available via Eventbrite after the webinar. So keep an eye out for your email. And then the presentation, the recording of this presentation, including the slides, will be available on the NJCAHT YouTube channel in the next day or so. So keep an eye out for that. Fern, we did have one question from someone who did not register through Eventbrite. They used the Zoom link provided in an email. Is there a way that anyone in that situation could get the recording? Or I'm sorry, get the links from the presenters?
You know what? I'll have to check on that.
I'll just quickly say yes, if they
Kate.
could send an email to the office, info@safernj.org, we will send that out to them.
Great.
Thanks, Kate.
And Kate or Fern, would you mind just dropping that email in the chat as well, just so that people can see it? Thank you so much. Okay, so I will jump to some more content specific questions. So this was a question that came through for Allison at the beginning. So Allison, how can a consumer discern which brands are subject to forced labor? I know that might be pretty specific, but any insight there would be great.
Thanks. If we're talking about at the raw cotton level or the cotton farming level, it's pretty difficult. And again, that's by design. Brands have helped to create the system of opaque supply chains. And let me tell you that if a bunch of NGOs and academics can trace cotton supply chains to the raw material level, then multinational companies can too. And what we need to do as consumers is actually demand that they do this. We need to demand our governments to put these requirements on companies, because essentially what we have is an economic system in which corporations are allowed to police themselves through voluntary social responsibility standards. It's like the fox guarding the henhouse. And we need to move to a system of mandatory human rights due diligence in supply chains, because, you know, Sam can be producing beautiful, organic, sustainably produced cotton with labor rights protected potentially at the raw material level, that then goes into a cotton supply chain with no more labor guarantees. And so what we really need, I know everyone wants to be a responsible consumer, and there are some small ways we can do that, but it's like giving up plastic straws to fight climate change. We actually need governments, systems, and corporations to move as well. And so I put in my resources and action items: vote for governments that hold the corporations accountable. There are some, you know, there is some credible reporting on cotton supply chains. I'm happy to share it with those who are interested, and try to understand what companies are doing if they're kind of going deeper than, you know, slapping a label on something. What is behind the label? So be a skeptical consumer.
And I just want to add to what Allison just said. You'll be receiving after the event. We tried to do a little research ourselves to come up with some brands and places where you could buy responsibly sourced items. But it's very, very difficult, as Allison is saying. So you will get that list, but I would say don't depend on it. Just do your own research. And when you're satisfied, that's the best you can do at this point in time. So I'll just leave it at that, and we'll talk about that maybe a little later. Courtney?
Great. Thank you so much, Allison and Fern. The next, I have a few questions for Nely and Natalia. They're fairly similar, so I'll try to compile them a bit. But aside from the fair food program that you've decided, and perhaps fair trade, which we've seen a lot of times on coffee and chocolate, what is the best way to avoid purchasing produce that was harvested potentially via forced labor? Are there any companies or certifications that are reputable in supermarkets?
Mientras que.
Ujú.
Dale.
Sí, una de las cosas que hace el programa de comida justa precisamente es la transparencia. Siempre bajo los acuerdos del programa de comida justa, cada acuerdo que tenemos con la corporación es porque esa corporación está comprometida, ¿verdad?, a proteger derechos humanos con los trabajadores, y tenemos una lista de las corporaciones que están trabajando con el programa de comida justa, y también la lista de rancheros. Eso también hay una etiqueta que hemos creado para que el consumidor que se interesa precisamente comprar de corporaciones donde sus productos son conseguidos con el respeto del trabajador, puedan guiarse a esas corporaciones. Por ejemplo, ahí está Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King y Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. Ahí hay otros supermercados, ¿verdad?, que tienen la etiqueta para que el consumidor vea que de ahí pueden conseguir el tomate o las frutas, y más que nada el tomate, porque el programa cubre ahorita por lo pronto el tomate y las flores. Pero sí, esa es una manera donde el consumidor puede asegurar, ¿verdad?, que ese es un producto cosechado de los ranchos de Florida, donde está el programa de comida justa.
And so, yeah, within our program, one thing that we normally show during our presentations is a visual of all the companies that are under the program. But right now they're kind of changing and editing the visual a little bit. So this is a list of the companies, and you'll see there's a mix here of fast food places, of supermarkets, of food service providers that are part of the Fair Food Program. And so our program was created intentionally, right? All of these companies didn't come on their own, right? We had to have campaigns against each one of them, but they're now committed to purchasing only from farms under the Fair Food Program. And so when in most of these, right, is just for tomatoes, because when we first started, it was for the tomato agriculture worker. And that's a lot of what you still see here in town. And we have since expanded into other industries again, but most of this, again, tomatoes. So I just sent a link in the chat, and I can send it over so it can be sent along with the email later. But this shows you the participating buyer, so the direct places that we can purchase from. But right, you're seeing some really big places here. You're seeing Walmart, you're seeing Whole Foods, you're seeing Trader Joe's as some of the biggest places. Right. And I mean, from this list, you can see the people who have been holding out and refusing to sign on to this program, because everybody has been invited, but not everybody is wanting to join. And so just one thing there. This also shows the growers. So if you're ever in a place where, okay, there's no Trader Joe's, there's no Walmart, I'm going to Target, this gives you a list of the actual growers and the farms that, you know, each time you go and you buy strawberries or you buy tomatoes or apples, it tells you what the farm is. So you'll be able to see this. We do have a fair food sticker that you could like use in a market, but those are barely ever put on any of the produce. So it's better to just kind of either have this list handy or purchase from the participating buyers.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. So the next question I have would be for Allison, again, probably on the more of a legislative or government standpoint, but do you have any examples of countries that are doing a good job as a whole at preventing cotton products being tainted with forced labor, whether that's internally or being imported into their country?
So right now, the US is actually leading the pack for Uyghur forced labor in particular. We have a law in the US called the Tariff Act, which prevents any good produced in whole or in part with forced labor from entering the US by the Customs and Border Protection. And there are lots of issues with this law and the way it's enforced and the way allegations are brought and how they're resolved. But CBP, Customs and Border Protection, did put a ban or an import control measure on cotton goods made in the Uyghur region. All cotton goods made in the Uyghur region. The issue there is traceability. And at the end of December, because cotton goods from the Uyghur region or cotton produced by Uyghur forced labor might be transshipped to Bangladesh to be spun, to Malaysia to be produced into fabric, to Vietnam to be sewn. And, nobody is importing a box that says, from Xinjiang anymore because it's prohibited. In December, a new law went into effect called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It creates the rebuttable presumption that any good produced in whole or in part in the Uyghur region or with Uyghur forced labor is produced with forced labor and therefore banned. It's going to affect massively supply chains, not just cotton, because so many goods are produced in China. Again, this is only as regards Uyghur forced labor, and there are going to be a lot of issues with enforcement. The EU is moving toward mandatory human rights due diligence requirements for companies. There's some other legislative proposals around, but this is the German Supply Chain Act. I put some of them in my slides I didn't get to cover. You'll see some of those laws. I think this is where we're moving globally, but we need a lot more pressure on governments to really enact robust requirements on companies.
Thank you. Fern, I just want to confirm we have a couple minutes left.
Like one more question.
One more question?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so then the last question, let me see if there's someone good to bring home here. This could be for Nely or Allison or both. You both shared a lot about the potential for forced labor in the cotton industry, which was really helpful. But are there specific points in production that we might see forced labor more because most farmland in some areas is machine picked? So are there other areas to be looking out for off the top of your heads?
Can you help me understand what you're getting at? New areas that we haven't yet identified?
Yes. So essentially, I think the question is basically asking that in the absence, in the presence of picking with machinery, are there still other areas of the supply chain where forced labor might be present?
Okay. Yeah, I would just say that machine picking is not a guarantee of
Okay.
protection against forced labor. I mean, we have Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan for many years. I was told that once we introduce machine picking, the forced labor system will end. No. You can also have decent work in cotton picking. There is nothing wrong with agricultural work as long as it is decent work that has, labor rights protections in it. But there are many aspects to cotton production where there can be forced labor. We've seen it in preparing fields, in hand topping or thinning cotton, in weeding, in irrigation ditch digging. That's just at the production level. And then throughout the processing and manufacturing, there are risks for forced labor. And just a note, again, we've talked a lot about certifications. I really do caution a lot of skepticism around certifications, particularly in garment and textile supply chains. Many of you will remember the Bangladesh Rana Plaza fire in which thousands of garment workers were killed. That was a certified factory, that facility. So you could certify a lead life preserver if you want. not all certifications are created equal. So you really need to look at quality, and there need to be demands for transparency.
Thank you, Allison. We're running really short on time, and I'm really sorry about that, because this is amazing, and all the questions, and there's so much to know, but I'm going to, if you don't mind, share my screen for the last time. Oh, I'm still, something went wrong here. All right, sorry, I'm just going to do it from here. I just wanted to mention a few things to tie things together. I apologize, I can't get it to do what it's supposed to do. So what, basically the whole point is, when everybody asks, what can you do about it? And I think Allison made pretty clear that it's very, very difficult as a consumer to assure yourself that you are not buying goods made with forced labor. But you can educate yourself in your community and pass this presentation on to friends and affiliated groups. You can choose fair trade certified products in general. You can talk to your legislators about banning products, which Allison had referred to some laws that we have. And I just wanted to say a couple of things at the end of this. First, I wanted to thank our speakers immensely tonight for educating us and giving us a lot to think about. I want to say to everyone who's on this that while it's overwhelming to hear this, personally, I think it's not completely up to us as individuals to solve this problem, although we can help. So while we can shop in a more mindful way, and you'll be receiving the resource list, and thank you, Kat, for doing that, it's important to know that probably the best way is to help push the corporations and companies to source their products in a more responsible way. And unless they're pressured by public outcry or bottom line numbers, they won't change. So yes, we have work to do, but we can't do it alone. And I want to try to make everyone feel a little bit better when they buy things, is that you can't buy everything that is sustainable and organic and well-sourced. You do what you can and feel good about that, and then just try your best to do these things. There's one, I did want to put this up, and you'll get this. This is with Freedom United. It's a petition that they have up, and this is probably old, so hope they probably have a lot more signatures by now, but we will send you that link in the follow-up. And in general, what can you do about human trafficking? Know where to call for help, report human trafficking to the 24-hour hotlines, and this is in general for both labor and sex trafficking. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, 888-3737-888, or help or info to be free, 233-733. And please visit us on safernj.org, because all of this stuff will be up there, and lots more information for those of you who want to get involved. And again, thank you, everybody. And we went about 3 minutes over, but I think it's well worth it. And I think everybody will get this follow-up, and you'll have a better idea of what to do. Well, thank you, everyone, for your time tonight, for joining us. Natalia, Allison, Sam, and Nellie, thank you so much.